He didn't look down. That was the thing everyone who saw it would remember. Theodore Crane III walked through the entrance of the Aldrich Foundation Gala, moving the way men like him always move through rooms. Forward, uninterrupted, the assumption of space as a birthright so deep it had stopped being conscious decades ago. The woman was carrying a tray of champagne flutes. He caught her shoulder with his forearm. The tray went first, crystal shattering across the marble floor of the Aldrich Center's grand foyer, and then she went, one knee down, one hand out to catch herself, the other grabbing for the tray stand that wasn't close enough. 340 guests saw it. Theodore Crane III did not break stride. He did not look down. He said something to the man beside him, and they both laughed and kept walking. The woman on the floor pressed her palm flat against the marble and steadied herself. She was 58 years old. She was wearing the event staff uniform. She had been in this building 10,000 times, and she had never once walked through it as a guest. Behind Theodore Crane 30 feet up the foyer wall, her portrait looked down at the room with the permanent patience of someone who had always known this day would come. Rewind 40 years. Here is where it begins. The first time Miriam Cross walked into the Aldrich Center, she was 18 years old and had taken 3 buses from the east side to get there. It was 1984. The center had just opened. A gleaming new arts and civic venue funded by the Aldrich Family Trust, cornerstone of the downtown revitalization plan, the kind of building that announced itself as a gift to the city while remaining quietly, structurally inaccessible to most of the city's residents. Miriam knew this. She also knew that the center's new director had announced an open call for a youth arts residency, and that the residency came with studio access, a small stipend, and instruction from working artists. She had a portfolio under her arm that her high school art teacher had helped her assemble, 12 pieces charcoal and oil, the kind of work that her teacher had said, with the specific emphasis of someone choosing their words carefully, was unlike anything she had seen from a student in 20 years. Miriam had stood in the foyer, this same foyer 40 years younger, the marble not yet worn smooth by the weight of decades, and looked at the ceiling and the light and the walls hung with the collection the Aldrich family had donated. And she had felt 2 things simultaneously, that she belonged here and that the building did not yet know it. She had applied, she had been accepted, she had taken those 3 buses every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years, and by the time the residency ended, she had won a regional competition, sold 3 pieces to a private collector, and been asked by the center's then director to come back the following year as a junior studio instructor. She had never really left. 40 years, that was the span of it. Miriam Cross had spent 40 years building a life in this building and around it. Instructor, then senior instructor, then director of community programs, then artistic director, a title she'd held for 14 years and from which she had shaped the center's residency program into something that had launched more than 60 working artists from communities the Aldrich family had never considered when they built the place. She had fought for every budget line. She had sat in every meeting where someone wanted to redirect arts funding towards something more demonstrably profitable. She had won most of those meetings through the combination of patience, data, and the specific authority of someone who had been in the room longer than anyone else at the table. She had never been wealthy. She had never been connected in the way that the Aldrich Center's board members and donors were connected. What she had was the work and the record of the work, and the 40-year accumulation of a reputation that the people who ran the center's fundraising had come to understand was worth more to them than any single donor's annual gift. This was the part Theodore Crane III did not know. Theodore Crane III had inherited Crane Holdings at 32 when his father died of a heart attack during a board meeting, a passing that his eulogists described as poetic and his surviving colleagues described as characteristic. Theodore, too, had built a regional real estate empire across 4 states and left his son a portfolio valued at $2.4 billion and a family name that opened doors that would otherwise have been locked from the outside. Theodore III had spent the 19 years since his inheritance growing the portfolio to $4.1 billion, acquiring 2 additional commercial real estate companies, and expanding the family's philanthropic profile in the specific way that a certain category of wealthy person expands philanthropy, visibly at events, with his name on plaques. The Aldrich Center had attracted his attention 18 months ago when the board, navigating a funding gap left by the departure of a major donor, had approached Crane Holdings about a naming rights opportunity for the newly renovated East Wing, $14 million for the Theodore Crane III East Wing of the Aldrich Center. Theodore had agreed with the enthusiasm of a man who understood that civic legacy was a form of currency and who had decided in the latter portion of his 40s that he wanted some. He had attended 3 board meetings. He had been photographed at 2 cultivation events. He had signed the check and accepted the framed architectural rendering of the wing with his name on it and put it in his Manhattan office next to the one with his father's name on a hospital pediatric ward in Greenwich. He had never met Miriam Cross, had never heard her name, had never, in 18 months of engagement with the Aldrich Center, asked who ran the programs that justified the institution's existence in the community it claimed to serve. This was the nature of a certain kind of donor. They gave to buildings. Buildings had their names on them. The people inside the buildings were a separate category. He had been told, as a matter of course, that the Gala was also celebrating the center's 40th anniversary. He had been told there would be a tribute. He had not asked what the tribute was. The Gala had been 18 months in the planning and 6 months in active execution by the center's development team, which had long ago learned to plan around the institution's 2 distinct populations: the donors who funded it and the artists and community members who animated it. These populations occupied the same rooms on nights like this, but moved through them differently, spoke different languages of meaning, and understood the evening's purpose in ways that only occasionally overlapped. Miriam had known about the portrait for 4 months. The board had commissioned it, a formal oil portrait, 3 feet by 4 feet, painted by one of her own former residents, a young woman named Danielle Foster, who had come through the program at 17 and was now represented by a gallery in Chicago. Danielle had done 3 sittings with Miriam in October and November, and the portrait had been delivered to the center 2 weeks before the Gala, crated and leaning against the storage room wall with a card that said, "Do not hang until evening of." Miriam had peeked. She had stood in the storage room looking at herself, looking back from the canvas, and felt something she did not immediately have words for. Something between recognition and discomfort. The feeling of being seen by your own reflection in a mirror you didn't expect. She had gone back to her office and kept working. The evening of the Gala, she arrived at 5 to supervise the setup. The same 5 o'clock she had arrived at for every major center event for 22 years, in the same dark blazer she wore when she needed to move between administrative and front of house without changing. She supervised the table layouts, checked the sound system, confirmed the catering placement with the event manager, reviewed the tribute program order with the board chair. At 7:30, she changed into the event uniform, white shirt, black vest, server's kit, because 2 of her catering staff had called out sick, because she had always done this, because there was no version of Miriam Cross that was above carrying a tray when the event needed it. She had told the board chair she'd be doubling for the first hour. The board chair had started to object. Miriam had looked at her in the way that ended objections. She was carrying a tray of champagne flutes through the grand foyer at 8:22 p.m. when Theodore Crane III came through the entrance. He was mid-sentence to the man beside him, his director of external affairs, she would later learn, moving with the momentum of a man for whom the world arranged itself. She was moving toward the east bar tray level. Eyes on the crowd ahead, she saw him a half-second before impact. Not enough time. His forearm caught her left shoulder with the full weight of forward motion. The tray left her hands. The crystal went down in the specific sound of expensive things breaking. Not a single shatter, but a cascade, each flute finding its own note on the marble. She went to one knee, right hand out, left hand grasping for the tray stand. The marble was cold and hard, and she was 58 years old, and her knee sent a sharp report up through her hip that she absorbed without showing. She heard the laughter. She heard the footsteps continuing. She heard the murmur moving through the guests closest to the entrance. 340 people recalibrating their attention toward the foyer, and she heard the specific quality of silence that settles when something has happened and people are waiting to see what it means. She pressed her palm flat on the marble. She stood up. She did not rush it. She straightened her vest, looked at the broken crystal on the floor, and caught the eye of one of her catering staff across the room. A young man named David, 22 years old. 2 years into the center's youth employment program that she had built from scratch in 2009, he was already moving toward her with a dustpan. Behind Theodore Crane III, who had not yet turned, who was now 20 feet into the foyer accepting a champagne flute from a circulating server and introducing himself to a city council member, the portrait had been unveiled an hour earlier. It hung 30 feet up the foyer wall in the position the board had chosen specifically, facing the entrance, the first thing you saw when the doors opened. Lit by the same soft track lighting that illuminated the Aldrich collection, Miriam Cross, 58, painted in oil by Danielle Foster, looking out from the canvas with the expression that Danielle had captured in the third sitting. Not pride exactly, not authority exactly, but the particular face of someone who had been in a room for 40 years and knew every corner of it and was not finished yet. The portrait had been hanging for 63 minutes. Theodore Crane III had been in the building for 90 seconds. He had not looked up. He looked up when the board chair reached him. She had crossed the room in the way that board chairs cross rooms when something has happened that requires a different kind of management than the one currently in progress. She touched his elbow. She said something close to his ear. She watched his expression. He turned. He looked at the floor, the broken glass, David sweeping it with quiet efficiency, a dark wet stain on the marble where the champagne had cooled. He looked at the woman in the white shirt and black vest who was standing beside the tray stand with the specific composure of someone who has been absorbing this category of moment for a very long time and has long since decided how to hold it. Then he looked up. 30 feet of foyer wall. The portrait, the face in the canvas looked back at him. He did not immediately understand. He looked from the portrait to the woman in the catering uniform. From the woman to the portrait. The resemblance, the same face, 40 years apart in expression, identical in bone structure, and in the quality of the gaze, registered slowly, the way things register when the mind is working against an assumption it has already settled. That's, he started. Miriam Cross, the board chair, said. Her voice was even. Artistic director, 40 years with the center. She paused. The person you just knocked down. The foyer had gone quiet in the specific way that 340 people go quiet when they are listening without appearing to listen. The string quartet in the East Hall had not yet started. The moment had the clarity of an uncluttered space. Theodore Crane III looked at Miriam Cross. Miriam Cross looked at Theodore Crane III. Her expression had not changed from the one she'd worn when she'd stood up from the marble floor. Whatever internal accounting she was running, it was running entirely behind her eyes, invisible to the room. He took a step toward her. I didn't. I apologize I didn't see you. I know, she said. The two words landed with the weight of 40 years behind them. Not an accusation, a fact. The specific, complete fact of a woman who had been unseen in this building and around it, and despite it for 4 decades, and who had built something extraordinary in the space that unseeingness had tried to occupy. I'm Theodore Crane, he said, as if the name would recalibrate something. I know who you are, Miriam said. Your name is going on the East Wing. She looked at him steadily. I approved the renovation plans. The board chair closed her eyes for 1/2 second. Several guests near the entrance who had heard the exchange looked at the floor of the middle distance with the expression of people who have just witnessed something they will be describing for years. Theodore Crane III stood in the foyer of a building that had his name pending on the East Wing and her face on the wall, and said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. What happened after that did not happen at the gala. It happened over the following 3 weeks in the specific unhurried way that consequential things happen when the person driving them is patient and has been patient for a long time. Miriam did not file a complaint. She did not speak to the press. She did not post to any platform or issue any statement. What she did was continue working as she always had and wait, which she had also always done, and let the moment in the foyer do what moments in front of 340 witnesses do when they are not managed away. Theodore Crane called the center's board chair 2 days after the gala. He asked for a meeting with Miriam. The board chair asked Miriam. Miriam said yes. She had a slot at 2 o'clock on Thursday. She could give him 45 minutes. He arrived on time. He sat across from her desk, in the office she had occupied for 14 years, with its framed residency applications and its wall of photographs of former students, and its view of the East Courtyard where the youth program held its summer workshops. He looked around the room the way people look at a room when they are understanding belatedly what was in it. He had, in the 2 days between the phone call and the meeting, asked someone at the center to send him Miriam's biography. He had read it. He had read the program materials. He had looked at the list of 61 artists who had come to the residency. He had found 3 names he recognized: a sculptor whose work was in 2 of his colleagues' corporate collections, a painter whose piece had sold at Christie's 2 years ago for a number he remembered because it had surprised him, and a photographer whose portraits he had seen in a gallery opening he'd attended in the spring, and discussed with his wife for 20 minutes afterward. He sat in the chair across from Miriam's desk and said, "I owe you an apology, a real one, not the one I gave you in the foyer." Miriam looked at him. "All right. I didn't see you," he said. "Not just at the gala. I've been engaging with this institution for 18 months, and I did not know your name." He stopped, started again with the care of someone who had thought about what he was trying to say and was finding that it was harder to say than he'd expected. "That's not how I want to operate." "How did you find out my name?" Miriam asked. "The board chair. The night of the gala." "Yes, I've been in this building for 40 years, she said. "The work we do here, the residency, the youth program, the community partnerships, it doesn't have a wing named after it. It doesn't have a plaque. What it has is 61 artists working professionally and 430 young people from East Side neighborhoods who have had access to studio, instruction, and mentorship and employment that they would not have had otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you because you asked to meet with me. And if we're going to talk honestly, you should know what you walked past." Theodore Crane was quiet for a long moment. "What would it take," he said finally, "to put a real endowment behind that work?" They talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. The 45-minute slot became the rest of the afternoon, the board chair joining at 4 o'clock, the center's development director joining at 4:30. By the time Miriam walked Theodore Crane to the foyer at 6:15, the shape of something had formed. Not a named wing, not a plaque, but a 10-year programmatic endowment, structured to fund the residency and youth program at full capacity regardless of annual fundraising fluctuation, with a board seat for a community-nominated representative and a reporting structure that answered to program outcomes rather than donor preference. It was, Miriam would tell the board chair later, the first conversation she'd had with a major donor in 14 years that had been about the work first. "What changed?" the board chair asked. Miriam thought about it, about the foyer, the marble floor, her palm flat and cold, and the sound of the crystal, the portrait, the 2 words she'd said, "I know," and what they'd carried. "He looked up," she said simply. The endowment was announced at a board meeting 3 months later. It was reported in the arts section of the city paper and in 2 national publications that covered civic philanthropy. The article in the larger of the 2 publications ran a photograph, Miriam Cross in her office, the wall of residency photographs behind her, the east courtyard visible through the window. The caption identified her as artistic director and noted she had been with the center for 4 decades. The portrait was still in the foyer. Nobody had discussed moving it. It would hang there for as long as the building stood, the board chair had decided unilaterally, because the building had been standing for 40 years, and the portrait was the first honest record of who had actually held it up. Danielle Foster saw the article from Chicago and sent Miriam a voice message. She was crying a little in the way you cry when something you made has done what you hoped it would do, and you hadn't been certain it would. Miriam listened to it twice in her car in the parking garage before she went back up to her office. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she sat in the car for a moment with her hands on the wheel and felt the full weight of 40 years. The 3 buses at 18, the Tuesday and Thursday residency trips, the budget meetings, the boardrooms, the 61 artists, the 430 young people, the marble floor at 58. And let it rest on her for just a moment before she set it down and went back to work. She had 3 residency applications to review, a workshop scheduled to finalize, a meeting with the youth program coordinator about the spring cohort. The building was waiting. It was always waiting. And she was always already here.